Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the next session. And we're excited to have Marcus A. Davis with us. Marcus is the co-executive director and co-founder of Rethink Priorities, which is a think tank dedicated to figuring out the best ways to make the world a better place. He leads the research and strategy focusing on animals. Prior to that, he was a co-founder of Charity Entrepreneurship and Charity Science Health. His talk is called Cost Prioritization within Animal Advocacy, and he will talk about deciding which interventions are best to tackle, which can be very challenging. The range of possible interventions is vast, and the factors to which to compare are complicated and interrelated. In the presentation, Marcus discusses some guidelines and consideration when selecting among possible interventions. So, hello, Marcus. I'm excited to have you, and let's proceed to a presentation, which will be followed by Q&A and a networking session.
How should we decide which areas of animal advocacy to focus on? Every year, humans use, farm, capture, and kill animals on a tremendous scale. Trillions are used annually. Frequently, these animals live their lives in terrible conditions, and often they end up in even worse conditions. Given this, and given that animal advocates have limited resources to deploy, we face choices, we face trade-offs. We have to prioritize both on which animals to help and how best to help them. One way to prioritize among the list of all possible options, from helping dairy cows in North America to farm crustaceans in Southeast Asia, is to think through a framework like importance, neglectedness, and tractability. Some of you may be aware of this, but roughly, this framework tries to outline what are important factors in figuring out what's the best thing to do. Importance here is how many animals are impacted, how big is the impact on them, how big is the welfare change, that is. Neglectedness is thinking through how much more room is there for additional help here, like how many people are working in the area, and what would a marginal effort do here. Finally, tractability, thinking through how easy is it to make the change you want to see in the world. How likely is a given campaign to succeed? I like this framework and think it's pretty useful, though I have some critiques of it, some of which I'll get into. If you're an advocate at the early stage of your career, I think this INT framework is a really good tool for figuring out at the highest level which areas might need the most help, where you can be the most helpful. The more uncertainty I think there is in figuring out how best a particular action is likely to work, how likely is the thing to succeed, the better I think it is to focus on thinking of importance and tractability and neglectedness with your decision making. When you're thinking through highly specific interventions, what matters is marginal cost effectiveness. In order to estimate that, you really have to think through the specific context in which you're trying to execute action and the particular details of the region you're focusing on. I want to walk you through some examples here of some high-level considerations in this context, and through hopefully some at the more specific intervention level, how you would go about using this type of framework to make a decision. Overall, I want to emphasize that there aren't clear answers to all the topics I'm going to cover, and that I'm going to skip over some counter arguments and counter considerations, largely due to time constraints. But I also want to press that the slides here are going to be made available. There'll be a link listed in the last slide in my talk, and that many of the links down in speaker's notes will contain additional information about the topics I'm covering. Okay, let's begin with thinking through importance. Improving conditions for a set of animals is all else equal better if there's more of them. I don't think this is a particularly controversial statement, but so long as you're thinking this way, it's really important to note that the size differences across the groups of animals that are impacted by humans is very large. It's vast. It's kind of difficult to get your head around. So I'm going to start by looking at the number of mammals impacted by humans. So all the numbers given here are the number of animals slaughtered annually. So as you can see, looking at the chart here, pigs are slaughtered at about 3 times the rate of cows every year, with nearly 1.5 billion pigs killed this way. Now, This is in fact a lot, even relative to the human population. That's a lot of pigs for every given human. But if you zoom back a bit and add in other land vertebrates, particularly chickens, you can see chickens vastly outstrip the number of pigs killed, with something like 48 times more chickens killed every year than pigs. And at this point, when we look at these numbers and decide, all else being equal, if these two interventions look equally promising on how likely they are to succeed, how likely they are to be effective for each individual animal being impacted. If you can help more animals per dollar, I think it's pretty clear that you can do better by helping chickens than pigs, or helping chickens rather than cows in particular. But the scaling doesn't really stop here. If you zoom out a bit to include fish, you will see that farm fish are in an order of very similar to the number of farm chickens, but the number of wild-caught fish every year actually vastly outstrips the number of farm fish. And again, at this point, you can say, well, thinking about what can we do to improve the lives of wild-caught fish, often slaughtered on board ships with no stunning and no precautions or anything like that, might end up looking quite promising. But again, this is not even all animals. You zoom out a bit and include crustaceans, you might see here that the number of farm shrimp actually outpaces the number of chickens, but by comparison to wild fish, there's not that many. But if you include farm crustaceans, if you include wild crustaceans, the numbers here are astronomical. In fact, this is a midpoint estimate from forthcoming work, but it seems like there's something like 30 trillion wild-caught shrimp slaughtered every year, which is an unbelievable number. When you do this type of analysis, one thing that becomes clear is the area you go into at the highest level, you spend your career focusing on areas where there's just less animals to possibly help. You would constrain yourself in a way that wouldn't be true if you didn't do this, and that's constraining on the maximal level of impact you might have across an intervention when you try to decide at that level. Now, one thing important to note here is this is just an example, and many times we're uncertain about how bad exactly a practice is, but animals differ very largely in number, so you might want to take that into account. But you really might also want to take account other things that might make a particular intervention important. Some of that here I'm going to cover. I'm largely going to gloss past some of these, but one thing is, what are their actual circumstances? So I am of the opinion that chickens raised in cages are among the worst lives for any animal living. And that condition might be significantly worse than that of a cow being raised in grazing land in Australia, for example. Thinking this through actually matters a lot for trying to assess which animals you should be focused on. But this factor is at least very commonly considered, even if it's informally. Still, it's very difficult to assess, as animals can't really respond by answering surveys about how good they feel about their conditions on a 1 to 10 scale. I should also note here that we're trying to make progress on these, I guess, as humanity, trying to better understand farm conditions, but we still have a long way to go. So this is actually a particular area where I think if you're thinking about what to focus on with your career, this might be a good place to look. Next, I'm going to note here the probability of sentience. So I think it's true that different animals have various cognitive capacities, and some of them might be more or less likely to actually have experiences of pain and pleasure. In particular, I'm much more confident that a chimpanzee has experiences like I do compared to, say, a chicken, even though I still think it's quite likely for a chicken. This type of factor can be included, sometimes it is, but it's one thing to flag. But after flagging it, I'm just going to move past and for the remainder of the talk, not really get into this. Finally, there's a third bucket here, things you might consider something called moral weight. So what is this? There are various dimensions of which animals differ. One of them might be the intensity of their experiences. So subjectively, some experiences might be stronger felt or weaker felt, but additionally, there are other things about the nature of subjective experience that might differ. In particular, listed here with the graph, it might be possible or even probable that, say, a bee experiences the world at a different rate than, say, a turtle does, or even a human does. And for that reason, it might be important to note this when assessing which animals you want to focus on helping. Additionally, there are other things that might come up here, things like, say, an octopus having more than one experience at a given moment, given the nature of its nervous system. All this said, these are largely theoretical considerations. These aren't things I think are that practical to consider right now, though I do think down the line in the future, after additional study and research goes into this, this is something I think animal advocates should be aware of. Having said all that, I want to retreat from the theoretical considerations and move back into thinking about neglectedness and tractability. So with neglectedness, what we're really concerned about here is what does an additional resource here look like, be that in time or money or effort. So all else being equal, you might think that being the 10,000th person to go say, look into helping dog shelters in your particular region may be less effective than being the 5th person to start thinking about how best to help crustaceans. Now, this isn't always going to be the case for some reasons I'm going to get into, but it is an initial starting point thinking through this topic of how best can I use my marginal impact. Now, when thinking this type of thing, it's also really important to think through tractability. So not just how many people are working on the topic, but just very practically, how easy is it to actually do the thing you want to do? So it might be the case that there are particularly large political barriers, or it might be the case that there's a large public opposition to the thing you do that might make what you want to achieve very difficult. Or it might be that the option you want to consider, or the option that it looks promising, actually takes a huge number of resources or a huge number of people to achieve, and in that case might not be very well suited to individual action. One of the problems with taking account of these factors at the intervention level is sometimes it can be very difficult to figure out how additional resources would actually impact actions. So I'm going to take a look at a couple of different models here, like very, very much simplifications. But when you're thinking these through, they might be helpful. So turning to the first model, in this framework, as you can see, when you were to engage in this intervention, this hypothetical intervention, at the very beginning, there might be a lot of initial setup costs, and then you start to see some returns after those setup costs. Finally, those returns start to taper off after additional resources are put in. Now, it's, I guess, I would say a rather standard dynamic, and it's one that people might say applies to corporate campaigns for chickens. One reason you might say that is something like at the very beginning, people came up with the idea, they had to think through strategies, they had to think through work plans, build out staff, and then once having done that, they can start selecting targets, company A, company B, company C, and initially you start to see returns once you actually target these companies, and after spending time on it, eventually, I'm not saying this is actually true now, but eventually you might start to see declining returns as you pick companies further and further down your list on the low-hanging fruit, the list of low-hanging fruit, that is. Now, something like this only really applies if you ignore certain, say, political considerations. And one alternative here might be something like this model. And in this model, what you see is additional spending where you try to change a vote share. So trying to get a law passed, whether it be a ballot measure or getting additional legislators on your side. Now, in these type of contexts, again, you might see a scenario where your initial spending takes you a certain distance towards your goal, but as you try to gather additional support, it becomes harder and harder. The marginal spending gets you less and less of a return. But there's a really important difference here, and that is there's a significant threshold effect in that after you cross the 50% threshold, the law actually passes or if you fall short of that, the law does not pass. In this context, it might still be true, like on the margin, it becomes harder to spend money. But the really big counterpoint here that worth keeping in mind is that your overall spending, your overall portfolio actually was increasing in returns as you poured additional money into it. Now, I'm not saying this is a very likely scenario outside of this context. I'm not even saying that this particular scenario holds in something you can go apply to right now. What I think is important to take away here is that while neglectedness is important at the highest level, when you're thinking through particular interventions, you really need to think through how marginal effort impacts that particular context. You can't really abstract away at the highest level and think through only, oh, there are X number of people working on this. Sometimes it really does matter where you are in the grand scheme of things. As I'll get into a bit more, you can't really focus solely at the highest abstract level of the how many people working this at the cost. You have to think these things through at the intervention level. There are a number of other factors that are relevant to neglectedness and tractability, some of which I'm briefly going to touch on here. So the various factors of time, so like when does this pay off? Is it time sensitive? Do we need to execute this plan within 6 months? There are various cost factors here, particularly including whether you can afford to do the project, as I mentioned, or whether it just costs a lot of money relative to other options. So even if you can't afford it, maybe there's some cheaper option that would get similar results. Then there are various other things, including whether you need particular expertise. This is something very much relevant when thinking through the highest, thinking through these things at initial stage and trying to decide which area is focused on. We might help you set up a hiring plan, or it might help you set up your career plan if you're thinking this through. Similarly, thinking through what you might need in political connections or political coalitions you might want to build. And finally, I want to mention that sometimes sequencing might matter. So this is something where it might be the case that additional victories become possible after you win a certain one. So after you set some like legal precedent in theory, you might be able to get further victories down the line. This is something that I think is very easy to claim, but it's very often difficult to verify. Nevertheless, it's still an important consideration. Given all this, I want to step back and put these factors at a higher level together to think through cost level. So I want to turn to another hypothetical example, and this is a direct comparison of different causes. These are all hypotheticals. I've made all the data points myself here, and I don't think they're all necessarily true, but there are a few things that jump out even in this hypothetical example. For instance, looking at pet dogs versus some sets of farm animals, you can pretty clearly see that neglectedness varies very much across these issues. Additionally, the number of animals impacted varies quite a bit across these issues. So if you're trying to think through, again, at the highest level, where could additional resources here be useful, particularly if you're thinking further down the line, not just in the next 1 to 5 years, but in the next 10 to 20 years. I think this is a good starting point of thinking through these issues. I would also caution that I don't actually advise using a simple formula to make these decisions. Nevertheless, I do think even at this level, it's kind of easy to see differences at this distinction. Let's move to the intervention level. So on this level, what I think stands out to me is the difference in neglectedness. So sometimes there's going to be people working on something at the global level, but what matters at the intervention level is what's happening in your region. Who else is going to do this particular intervention where you are particularly doing it. You don't get this, of course, down to like the neighborhood block level necessarily, but it doesn't mean when you're thinking through how best to improve the world, it might be the case that something's neglected globally, but not relatively speaking where you are, or vice versa. Another thing to note here is the variance in the number of animals. So at this high level, it can be very difficult for pet interventions to look good, but one thing that is extremely relevant is, well, how does it actually compare in the number of animals impacted, given how likely this is to actually happen, right? So you might really want to think through what's the probability of success of this particular action, and similarly, what is the welfare improvement? So it's not just the number of animals you're helping, at least from my perspective, it's how big of a change are you making in their lives overall, all things considered. And in this context, the variance in uncertainty in how likely an action is to succeed is actually very relevant. And when you're like very uncertain, I think one of the better things to do is to fall back on, in this context, is this very neglected? Are there a lot of animals? Because it might have very wide error bars on whatever estimate you give here. Another thing that jumps out about this is the nature of interventions with low probability of success, but like a high number of animals impacted. So it might be the case that in this example, because I made it, changing the probability of success wouldn't really change the rankings here very much, or wouldn't change the estimated cost effectiveness per animal. But if you're running a real organization and you only succeed 2 out of every 100 times you try to go forth with an action, it can be very difficult and impractical to maintain staff support and funding from donors. Now, this is like an extremely practical constraint, but it is something very real that you face when you're trying to prioritize between different interventions. Generally speaking, building a model under which each of neglectedness and tractability factors gets some weight, and you combine that information with more objective information on scale can be very useful in separating interventions. You obviously there get a ballpark estimate of the number of animals impacted in your particular region, but you also get some sense of how hard or how easy some issue is, and how margin and resources in this context will actually be helpful. What's better for me is using this information as a guide. So make sure you don't forget key factors before you directly try to estimate how many animal years a given intervention can improve. To recap here, I hope these examples demonstrate that the specifics at the intervention level matter a lot in choosing effective actions. And if you hope to get hope to improve the lives, the most number of animals you can figure a lot out by trying some very rough guides at the cost level. Thinking through importance of neglectedness and tractability can be useful, particularly if you're early stage in your career. If your organization considering like your next broad area of focus, it can be useful deciding which of these might seem promising, particularly under areas of major uncertainty. In particular, given that scale varies by many orders of magnitude, a lot of value can be gleaned just by thinking through how many animals will this intervention affect. Even given this at the level of the intervention, what matters though is marginal cost effectiveness. So, but this is only sometimes correlated with neglectedness and tractability of an issue at the cost level. Sometimes there may be high setup costs, setting you up for better payoffs down the line, and sometimes it really is the case that additional resources spent on something where there are a lot of people are investing in it might not make much of a difference. All this is to say, for these reasons, I really think currently the best approach to using this type of model is using these as a guide, and then trying to attempt like a direct estimate of welfare adjusted animal years per dollar combined with your best adjustment. I'm really not a fan of using your intuition to try to guide what's the best action here, because the numbers are so vastly different that you can end up trying to run complex mathematical formulas in your head, which I don't think is a good idea in general. Overall, then, I really like to close by saying there's no simple formulas here. There's no simple answers for how best to do cost prioritization overall or within animal advocacy, but using this type of tool can be very helpful in making your decisions better at the margin. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, for this incredibly insightful talk. I think this was very helpful. and to everyone who attended. We have quite a few questions that have come in. The first one is from Jakub, who says that it seems that the animal advocacy movement is broadening its understanding where the most suffering may occur. For example, shrimp. If you had to bet when a group like yours will start having diminishing results on research on scale and or neglectedness? So the question is about when will a group like yours will start having diminishing results on research on scale and neglectedness?
That's a good question. I think scale and neglectedness will probably come apart here. So on scale, I guess first of all, I would say my error bars would be very wide. But on scale, I would hope that we've already seen most of the big surprises that we're going to see, and that in the next couple of years, we don't continue to encounter groups of animals that hadn't been estimated in such large numbers. All that said, I still would give a decent chance that there are some groups, possibly some species of farm fish, maybe in particular, where there may be significant undercounts in how numerous they are. There are a number of reasons for this. Sometimes there's uncertainty about average weight, but often we just have major uncertainty about what conditions are like in facilities that are often largely in Southeast Asia and or China, where many advocates, much of the movement right now is either not very large or doesn't have the type of sway and power that they do in some other countries. On neglectedness, I think this is much more of a moving target. In particular, like over time, what's neglected will change. We probably will reach some type of equilibrium at some point, but like over time, like as industries grow and shrink, as we make progress in some areas, and then maybe hopefully not lose ground in others, our understanding of where the marginal options are would alter.
Thank you for that. And we have another question from Vicky, who asks, how much would you weigh the possibility of increasing the price of animal products when evaluating the promise of an intervention?
This is very difficult. So the first thing I would say is I would be, how much I care about increasing the price would depend on how much I think this, number one, how much I think this would change consumption, how bad I think the lives are of the animals that are being consumed, and what the alternative would be to that animal. So sometimes a good example of this is in the States. A lot of times some people cut back on their beef consumption, but increase their chicken consumption, actually resulting in more animals being consumed, which I also think chickens in the US in particular live much worse lives than cows. So the answer is it really depends on the particular set of animals we're talking about and how big of a change we're talking about from the price change.
Okay, we might have time for two more. So if you were given $5 million and you have to spend it on one thing, an animal advocacy, for example, type of organization, intervention, research type, etc., where would you invest it?
This is really hard. I don't anticipate having $5 million immediately in my access. So I'm not giving this too much thought. Major grains of salt to whatever I'm about to say. That said, I guess this may be recency bias, but I tend to think that understanding better what's happening with invertebrates writ large is very valuable right now. Both that the crustacean numbers, which I guess recently became aware of, are extremely high, and there's some possibility of sentience for insects, and number of farm insects is expected to grow tremendously over the coming years. So I would guess prioritize animals that I think are particularly neglected, often for reasons to do with like how publicly appealing is this to much of the mass public, and also the people are less confident in their sentience, but in expectation, I think once you account for the numbers, it's still a possibility that this is the most important thing. So I would spend money on that, but I couldn't tell you in any detail whether that would be starting shrimp THL or whether it would be using some other type of action in order to improve the lives of these animals.